May it please the Court. Peter Webster on behalf of Applee Commonwealth. This is a straightforward case. It involves only one legitimate issue, and that issue poses a pure question of law. What duties, if any, does the rate rule impose on title insurers like Commonwealth? We believe the 3rd District in Blake answered that question correctly, holding 1, the rule is unambiguous, 2, use of the word provided does create conditions precedent to any duty on the part of title insurers, 3, an insurer may charge the lower reissue rate only if both a prior owner's policy was issued insuring either the seller or the mortgagor in the current transaction, and the reissuing agent and underwriter both retain in their files a copy of that prior owner's policy. 4, insurers have no duty to search for prior owner's policies. And 5, should either of those 2 conditions precedent not be satisfied, it is not permissible to charge the lower reissue rate. Here, it's undisputed that neither the reissuing agent nor Commonwealth ever had a copy of plaintiff's prior owner's policy until it was provided during discovery. Therefore, neither one of them had a copy of the policy in the file when the refinancing transaction was closed and the new mortgage policy issued.
Well, what do you say to their argument that they could just, that your client or the banks who are its agents could just toss the policy in the trash can and charge the higher rate?
Well, I have a number of responses to that. The first is that the plaintiffs in Blake made precisely the same argument, that if the rule were interpreted the way insurers have argued it should be, it would be absurd and illusory. Blake answered that.
Well, we're not bound by Blake, are we?
Well, no, you're not bound by Blake, but it's the only opinion out there, and we believe that it renders a clear, concise answer to every one of the questions in this case. The other reasons why insurers can't just throw away the policy are, first of all, they could be punished for it under the insurance code for not complying with the law. The second. So there is a legal requirement to retain the policy. There is a statute that says that OIR can bring sanctions for any violation of any OIR rule or statute.
So is there a rule or statute requiring retention?
Yes, the rate rule requires retention. The only possible way you can read the rate rule, it says provided, number 1, a prior owner's policy was issued, and provided, number 2, that both the reissuing agent and underwriter retain a copy of that policy, then the reissue rate shall apply. So unless both of those conditions are satisfied, there's no occasion to apply.
If you say the rule imposes a legal duty to retain the policies, aren't you saying that insurers have to charge the reissue rate unless they violate the rule?
No. It's undisputed that there are many situations where no matter how diligently an insurer may look for a prior policy, it can't be found. If you adopt their interpretation of the duty, which is if there's a prior owner's policy, we get the reissue rate, period. The first problem you have with that is it's utterly irreconcilable with the actual language of the rate rule, which requires the insurer and agent to retain a copy of that policy. The logical conclusion of their supposed duty would be, even if the insurer has no idea that a prior policy exists and therefore can't possibly find a prior policy, they have to apply the reissue rate.
Well, no,
But the rule says,
they say a quarter of the time they are the very Commonwealth is the very company that issued the prior policy.
Your Honor, I'm going to ask the panel to be very careful about the representations plaintiffs made in their briefs and at oral argument. The prior owners' policies that existed were prior owners' policies, period, at large. There is not one whit of evidence in this record to suggest any of those prior owners' policies were issued by Commonwealth. Not one whit. And so the class they're claiming should go forward regardless of whether we've got a correct interpretation and whether Blight had a correct interpretation of the rate rule. The class they're saying should go forward just can't exist because there's no evidence it exists. First of all, the Blights couldn't represent that class because they got their prior owner's policy from a different title insurance company, American Title Insurance. They didn't get it from Commonwealth, so they can't be a named class representative if the interpretation we're urging and the interpretation that the Blight court reached is correct. On top of that, that issue isn't even preserved because, as this court is well aware, to preserve an issue for appeal, one must make a timely motion or objection in the trial court and obtain a ruling with regard to that motion in the or objection in the trial court. Here we have neither. The correct motion that should have been filed if they wanted to preserve this issue of some sort of other class would have been a motion requesting leave to amend the complaint further. That would have been necessary because, number one, they would have to substitute new named plaintiffs because
we know that, right? That none of these named
that's
plaintiffs
absolutely right, Your Honor.
fit this smaller class.
Number two, they would have to redefine the class. This isn't a subclass, it's a different class. Number three, that proposed amended complaint would need to include allegations sufficient to demonstrate numerosity, commonality, and typicality of the proposed new class, and it would have to demonstrate...
Don't forget adequacy.
Well, adequacy is part of the next section of the rule. And they would have to demonstrate in the proposed amended complaint that the new named class representatives were in fact members of the new class and that they would fairly and adequately represent other members of the class. Because they didn't do that, the trial court had nothing to rule on, and hence this court has no issue to consider regarding some subclass on appeal. Dober versus Worrell, the Supreme Court decision that we cite in our brief, clearly stands for the proposition you cannot raise an issue for the first time on appeal. You just can't do it. Now, to get back to the construction of this rule, which is a pure question of law, I gave you one reason why their construction has to be wrong. It also it has to be wrong because there's nothing in the rule that even suggests such a duty. It has to be wrong because if you follow their supposed duty to its logical conclusion, title insurers would be liable even if they didn't know there was a prior policy and couldn't find it. And clearly, the way the rate rule is written, you have to retain a copy of that prior policy before you can charge the rate rule. And so if they couldn't do that because they didn't know it was there, they're going to be subject to penalties from the regulator for something they couldn't have prevented. That can't be what's intended. And on top of...
Well, I think you all have already figured out the solution, right? Don't you now give notice to anybody who's getting a replacement mortgage that give us your policy and we'll give you the reissue rate?
We do that, among other things. We do that, but lots of times the person doing the refinancing either doesn't remember that they had obtained a prior owner's policy, that's demonstrated in the record, doesn't have a copy, doesn't remember who issued it, or just doesn't want to be bothered with the effort of going to look for it. All of that is demonstrated in the record. But we do that. The record shows that several agents, and by the way, there are more than 6,000 agents, title insurance agents in Florida today, any one of whom could have written a prior owner's policy. But to get back to the reasons why
But there's some common database?
there is no common database. The evidence is
Not even among certain of the title insurance companies?
title insurers now maintain their own databases. But during the relevant period, Commonwealth and its affiliated companies never had more than 15% of the market. And so they did not have legal or practical access to 85% of the prior policies that were written. And if you look in our brief on page 6 or 7, there's a quote from a deposition.
Well, that's kind of a red herring because the renewals are going to be a lot more than 15% Commonwealth the first time. I mean, if you say
I don't understand.
Or if you say statewide, it's 15% Commonwealth and affiliates
Of the market.
of the market. In other words, the renewal mortgages are not just random
But-
statewide. They're people who Commonwealth very likely wrote the first one.
Oh, no. That's not their current class. Their current class is anyone who had a prior owner's policy from any title insurer.
For whom Commonwealth wrote the insurance for the second.
For the second.
Yeah.
And there is no way, legally or practically, that Commonwealth can obtain access to those prior owner's policies if they were written by another title insurer. And the rate rule clearly says, at some point, whatever point you want to say it, it says it, at some point they have to retain a copy of the prior owner's policy in their file or they'll be subject to penalties. Now, the final reason why their interpretation of the duty has to be wrong is in 1990, when this provision regarding retention of the prior owner's policy was first added to the rate rule. The legislative history clearly demonstrates that the reason it was added to the rule was to reduce the availability of reissue rates and thereby to increase the likelihood of solvent title insurers. Now you may say, that sounds kind of strange. Title insurance in Florida is a very competitive industry. What was happening before this retention requirement was put into effect was insurers were undercutting each other by giving the reissue rate in situations when they shouldn't be doing it. And they shouldn't be doing it because if you don't have a copy of the prior owner's policy, you haven't saved yourself the time in the title search that would justify allowing a lower rate. They were undercutting each other to try and get more of the business. So the Department of Insurance back in 1990 said, we're going to try and put a stop to this. And we're going to require you to have a copy of that prior owner's policy in your file to demonstrate that you charge the proper rate. And I mean, like is very clear to the effect that unless the copy of the prior owner's policy is in both the reissuing agents and reissuing underwriters' files, at the time the transaction is closed, the refinancing, there's no duty to give. There's not only no duty, it would violate the rule if you gave the lower rate.
But at bottom, this requirement to retain the policy is just to make life easier for the auditors, right?
No, that's one reason, but it's also designed to ensure that they don't offer the reissue rate in the first place if it's not justified by the reduced title search that can be done if you have in your possession the prior owner's policy, because you can start your search from the date of that policy and come forward. You can't do that if you don't have it.
Because there's some kind of agreement among the title
No,
insurers to
no.
indemnify in the event that the earlier policy.
There is that, and that can be helpful in a situation where the prior title searchers got it wrong. But the reason for the reduced rate is somebody has already done a title search up to a certain date, and the presumption is it's right. And if it's not, and you as an insurer have a copy of that prior owner's policy, you can seek reimbursement from the prior insurer. So it's just as clear as it can be that the obligation to have copies of these policies at the time the transaction closes.
Has the Department of Financial Services ever had occasion to express its views on how the rules should be interpreted?
These class actions have been going on for 11 years now. OIR has never done anything to change the rate rule. They cite to a letter from a gentleman named Center from the Department of Insurance, who they claim said it supports their duty. What they don't tell you is there are two subsequent letters by the same gentleman, both in the record, one at volume 39, page 7654, the other volume 39, 7656, that both state that if you don't have the prior owner's policy in your file at the time you close on the refinancing transaction, you have to charge the higher original rate. They don't cite either of those two. They just cite the first letter.
So if you get the policy the next day and retain it, you are in violation of the rule.
And again, Judge, work with me on the logic of that. The logic of that is the only justification for charging the reduced reissue rate is you don't have to do as much work searching the title if you have in your possession a prior owner's policy, because you only have to go back to the date of that policy. And so if you don't have that by the time you close on the refinancing and issue the new mortgage policy, you have to do the whole search.
What if you have a database that shows you that this policy, earlier policy issued?
If you have a database that shows you that the earlier policy issued, that doesn't help you, because you're likely not going to know when it issued. You're not going to know how much it was for. And that's another problem, because the reissue rate, even if you have a prior owner's policy, only applies up to the amount of the original owner's policy coverage. So if on refinancing the amount of insurance is more than it was in the original owner's policy, anything above the original owner's policy amount has to be charged at the original rate. And obviously, you can't make that determination unless you have a copy of the prior owner's policy in your possession. The simple fact is it's not possible to do that in every transaction. The rule they are, the interpretation they are advocating, in addition to all of the other problems, in addition to the fact that it's irreconcilable with what the language of the rate rule actually says, would create an irrebuttable presumption that in every case where there's a prior owner's policy, even if the insurer doesn't know about it, can't find it, they have to charge the reissue rate. And irrebuttable presumptions like that are unconstitutional. That's another reason why their interpretation has to be wrong. Thank you.
Thank you, Counsel.
If there's
He
no
says that
prior policy,
This rule is for the benefit of the companies to keep them solvent.
well, that's part of it. Certainly, the regulation of the rates is to ensure that they're solvent, but it's not to protect them, it's to protect consumers so that consumers can get recovery from them on their title claims so that they don't go bankrupt. And the rate rules require no discrimination. The rate can't be too high or too low. They set what the rate is. So they're a regulated entity. And contrary to what my brother started, the definition of provided is not a condition precedent. It can be. A condition precedent can be introduced by the word provided. The first part is a condition precedent. But the definition of provided is not a condition precedent. It said it can be a condition, could be a condition subsequent, or it can be a restriction, a limitation, a qualification. That's what we're saying it is in this case with regard to retaining. And to be very clear, I don't know, this ridiculous suggestion that I've misrepresented the record to you, I haven't. 25% of their files, the sample policy shows, have prior policies. I don't believe I said they were Commonwealth's prior policies. I don't know what relevance that would have. It doesn't matter if it's their own prior policy. It's that they have in their files, when they charge the original rate, 25% of the class had a prior policy issued by somebody, and that entitled them to the reissue rate. So I haven't misrepresented anything to this court. The duty to determine which...
Well, I think that came up in connection with the discussion of this, so of the subclass you are now, for the first time on appeal.
Well, that's not true either. Okay, first off, the preservation. This isn't the first time we've raised this. We raised this here a few years ago when we said, and this court said what would happen if we lost. And it said what would happen is you consider whether to modify the class or create subclasses. We said that in our motion for summary judgment at the very beginning. We made clear that these policies, the 25%, I get that number from our motion for summary judgment. Now, Judge Davis granted our motion and we won. So that was the end of it until Judge Foster reconsidered. At the hearing on the motion to reconsider, when it became clear that he was going to reconsider, despite the law that we said that he should respect the prior judge's ruling, we made exactly that argument. It's in the transcript. He says we can't raise it for the first time on reconsideration. His client was the one seeking reconsideration.
Can you give us the page number in the transcript?
The transcript is supplemental record 57, page 11,275. We raised it before all of that, or the idea that that you have people within the class who are qualified, even if you only look at who the policy was in. That's page 7511 from our motion. That's our motion for summary judgment, record volume 38, page 7511. So we did raise it directly to Judge Foster before he ruled, and then he ruled, and he ruled that the entire class gets summary judgment. So that was preserved. The duty to determine the rate is not something they can delegate to the borrower or to anybody else. They have that duty to determine it. And they say they can't get the policies from the other insurance companies. That's false. The amicus brief in this case, footnote 3, shows that they can. All they have to do is ask for it. They have a right under the indemnification agreement to get those policies. And even if on the front end they said, no, we don't want to give it, that would be, why would they do that? Why would one insurer refuse to give it to the other, which is going to cause a potential overcharge? Because they'll be in the same position the next time. That's why they have the indemnification agreement. And if this court enforces the rate rule and requires them to give the rate when there's a prior policy, then tomorrow, I guarantee you, the database will be up and running, and they'll all have access to each other's databases, and it'll take 2 minutes to find out if there's another policy. This is a classic case of kids killing their parents and begging for mercy for orphans. The only reason it's hard is because they've refused to do it. All they have the power within their, it's within their power to make it very easy to just do one entry in a database.
Thank you, Counsel.
Thank you.